U.S. President Joe Biden meets world leaders in Indonesia, while Vice President Kamala Harris visits Thailand for the APEC summit, as the United States shifts focus to the Asian continent. How will the U.S. hedge China's growing influence in the region? And what does it mean for Russia's war on Ukraine? On the Inside Story, Biden's road to Bali.
From Phnom Penh, Cambodia, I'm Patsy Widakuswara, VOA White House Bureau Chief. I traveled here with President Joe Biden, the first stop on his trip to Southeast Asia. From Phnom Penh, I'll take you to Bali, then Bangkok, following Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris as they try to curb China's influence in the region and broaden the coalition against Russia over its war in Ukraine. Stay with me on this episode of The Inside Story.
In his first stop in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, at the U.S. ASEAN summit, President Joe Biden reaffirmed to Southeast Asian nations that the U.S. is committed to ASEAN centrality, the principle that regional engagements are driven by the 10-country bloc, not great power rivalry.
ASEAN is the heart of my administration's Indo-Pacific strategy, and we continue to strengthen our commitment to work in lockstep with an empowered, unified ASEAN.
Political violence in Myanmar since last year's military coup against Aung San Suu Kyi's government was high on the agenda. Leaders have warned Myanmar's junta to implement ASEAN's peace plan or continue being barred from the bloc's meetings. Indonesia's President Joko Widodo will assume ASEAN's chair next year. He is expected to take a tougher approach than the current chair Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Sen.
Indonesia proposed that the participation of non-political level representation of Myanmar should also be applied beyond summit and foreign ministers meeting.
Biden met with Hun Sen, the region's longest leader, in office since 1985. Activists have urged Biden to hold Hun Sen accountable for the country's democratic decline. But with Phnom Penh firmly in Beijing's embrace, there may not be much that Biden can do. During his meeting with Hun Sen at the sidelines of the summit, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang pledged $27 million in development aid for Cambodia.
Whenever the pressure from the Western country, especially from the U.S., China will be at the back of the Cambodian government, provide the support. When the U.S. put a sanction to the Cambodian government, China will provide another economic support to the Cambodian government.
There's concern that Cambodia is secretly allowing Chinese warships to dock in its Ream naval base in the Gulf of Thailand. Earlier this year, Beijing funded to revamp the base, heightening fears among some ASEAN members concerned about Chinese expansionist ambition in the South China Sea.
From Phnom Penh, Biden traveled to Bali, Indonesia for the G20 summit with leaders of the world's 20 largest economies. There too, divisions overshadowed talks.
I flew with the president on Air Force One as radio pool reporter. While I've traveled on the presidential plane around 36 times in the past 4 years on the White House beat, this trip was special. I was going home. As the first Indonesian American to return to her birth country with the U.S. president, I am incredibly proud and grateful for this milestone in my career. Plus, the kind crew of Air Force One gave me extra presidential candy for my family and friends.
For President Joko Widodo, hosting the G20 summit here in Bali was meant to showcase Indonesia's progress under his presidency. But initially, he faced threats of boycott from Western leaders who insisted that he exclude President Vladimir Putin of Russia, a G20 member, as punishment for his invasion of Ukraine.
Widodo resisted. In the end, Putin chose not to come in person and sent Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in his place. I spoke with Indonesian Finance Minister Sri Mulyani Indrawati, who was instrumental in navigating geopolitical tensions ahead of the summit on the fallout of the war in Ukraine and the impact of the U.S.-China rivalry in the region.
From the very beginning, we said that the theme of recover together, recover stronger is very important. This is showing that the G20 as a global economic forum, premier global economic cooperation forum, should be able to address the issue of economically important globally, that is how to recover together, recover stronger from the pandemic. We also, as a presidency, we also remind the membership, especially the one who tried to saying that, well, why don't we just disinvite Russia? We said that the G20 was created to save the world from the economic collapse during the global financial crisis. And that kind of cooperation certainly will need it, not only facing with the global financial crisis back in 2008, but also when we are facing with the pandemic, in which all countries need to work together. No single country can actually address the issue like pandemic, which is actually borderless. And then also the issue regarding climate change, which is also require a lot of cooperation, definitely, in order for us to address the issue of this global challenge. So we reminded all the membership that this kind of cooperation is non-negotiable for us. This forum should not be breaking.
I want to move on to another meeting that was considered, partly Indonesia's diplomatic success, which is the meeting between President Biden and President Xi, which was some sort of modest lowering of tension in the region. From your point of view, from the point of view of Indonesia and the region, what is the most concerning on the U.S.-China rivalry? Do you feel that there is a new Cold War brewing in this region?
So for all of us, I think ASEAN 10, the rest of the world, we have the interest to make the relationship work in a responsible way, and that's exactly what is communicated by the two leaders. That is going to create less damage to the very fragile global economic recovery at this very moment, and at the same time also creating a much better, if they have any differences or any political objective, then they should have the ability to discuss among them. But for sure, Asia and ASEAN in general, this is the region which is being seen as the brightest spot of the world in terms of the economic performance, relatively safe in terms of the security as well as the war or tension in this case. And that's allowing many of the ASEAN countries to actually catch up and build and develop so that they are reducing the poverty, creating prosperity, and creating also a positive benefit to the world.
In a diplomatic compromise to U.S. and European leaders, Indonesia invited President Volodymyr Zelensky to speak virtually, despite Ukraine not being a member of the G20, group of the 20 largest economies in the world.
VOA's Ukraine White House correspondent Yulia Yarmolenko spoke with National Security Council's John Kirby in Bali about the peace plan that Zelensky presented at the summit.
One of the points in this 10-point peace plan was that after war ends, Ukraine wants to have a security guarantees, and one of the proposals is so-called Kyiv Security Compact. Does the United States support this format?
What the United States supports, again, right now, is a Ukrainian armed forces that can continue to defend their sovereignty and defend their people, to defend their country, and gain back the territory that Russia has taken or attempted to take in some cases. I'm not going to get ahead of where we are right now, and I'm certainly not going to get ahead and jump into what negotiations would look like. Obviously, we want the Ukrainian military to continue to succeed on the battlefield. And we are already talking with the Ukrainians about long-term defense needs and what that might look like. But we're just not at a point now where we can say definitively exactly what that's going to look like.
Bali is world-renowned as a tropical paradise. In another diplomatic win for Indonesia, this island of the God is a fitting setting for the meeting that was highly anticipated between two superpowers, President Joe Biden and his Chinese counterpart, Xi Jinping. Amid heightened tensions, both leaders stressed the need to manage differences and avoid conflict.
We, as the leaders of China and the United States, should play a role in guiding and setting the directions so as to find the correct direction for the development of the relations between our two countries.
In the meeting that lasted over 3 hours, Biden said he sought to lower tensions over Taiwan, a self-ruled island Beijing considers its breakaway province.
And I do not think there's any imminent attempt on the part of China to invade Taiwan. And I made it clear that our policy on Taiwan has not changed at all. It's the same exact position we've had. I made it clear that we want to see cross-strait issues peacefully resolved.
But just days after Biden and Xi met to lower tensions, Vice President Kamala Harris visited Palawan Island in the Philippines, underscoring that an attack on this U.S. ally would invoke U.S. mutual defense. Palawan sits just 330 kilometers east of the disputed Spratly Islands, claimed entirely by China and partly by the Philippines, Brunei, Malaysia, Taiwan, and Vietnam.
As the United States has long made clear, we support the 2016 ruling of the UN Arbitral Tribunal, which delivered a unanimous and final decision firmly rejecting China's expansive South China Sea maritime claims.
China, the Philippines, Brunei, Malaysia, Taiwan, and Vietnam have competing territorial claims in various parts of the sea, with Beijing claiming most of it. Skirmishes have often occurred. Philippines President Ferdinand Marcos Jr.
The upheavals that we are seeing, especially in the, not only in the region, but especially in the region, these partnerships become even more important.
China shot back.
We are not opposed to normal exchanges between the US and the Philippines, but such exchanges should not harm the interests of other countries.
As China increases military activity in the region, Washington is seeking to repair ties with Manila after fraught relations under previous President Rodrigo Duterte. Of Washington's 5 treaty allies in the Indo-Pacific, the Philippines is closest to Taiwan and therefore central to U.S. plans to deter and respond to potential Chinese attack on the island. Just how confident is Biden that Xi will not invade Taiwan? VOA's Mandarin White House correspondent Paris Wang asked John Kirby of NSC in Bali.
So did Xi Jinping promise President Biden anything during the meeting to make him say that, and can Taiwan and U.S. relax?
As the president said, we don't want to see these tensions result in the use of force. We want to see tensions over the Taiwan Strait solved peacefully. And we don't want to see that status quo change unilaterally. We certainly don't want to see it changed by force. There's no reason for that to happen, which is why the president felt it was important to meet with President Xi here face to face. They've already spoken 5 times before. They know each other, but it was important to have that discussion so that they could each set out their intentions, their priorities, their concerns. And that was done yesterday. The president feels very comfortable that he had a candid, forthright conversation with President Xi. And again, we're going to have our teams now move forward to work at a working level on some of these issues.
While Indonesian President Joko Widodo as host insists that G20 is an economic forum, not a political one, he could not escape geopolitical fault lines. And those fault lines literally exploded on the last day of the summit. The mangrove planting ceremony by world leaders hosted by Indonesian President Joko Widodo during the Bali summit was designed to highlight the G20's climate agenda. But an event 10,000 kilometers away caused late arrivals of NATO and G7 leaders due to a hastily arranged emergency meeting to discuss the explosion in Poland that killed 2 people. While the blast was not caused by a Russian missile, the threat of the war in Ukraine spilling over to neighboring Poland, a NATO member, triggering the alliance's collective defense principle and escalating the war is real. G20 leaders concluded their summit with a statement saying that most members strongly condemned the war in Ukraine, but that the forum was not the place for resolving security issues. But no tensions exist between VOA journalists who covered the summit.
We sent our Russian, Ukrainian, and Mandarin correspondents to Bali, as well as myself covering in English and Indonesian. And as you can see, there is no great power rivalry here as we report for VOA's global audience of 350 million. Thanks for the great teamwork, guys. It's been such a pleasure working with you and with our VOA Khmer service in Phnom Penh during the ASEAN Summit.
The G20 summit also boosted the tourism industry in Bali that took a hit during the pandemic. But the summit's impact is also felt by small business owners. Devyanti Parit spoke with some of them.
Punya Giri, an owner of a batik clothing and textile company, traveled from Bandung, West Java for a G20 exhibit of 300 small and medium-sized enterprises, or SMEs, from across the country. The Future SME Village is a designated area to promote Indonesian products within the enclave of five-star hotels where the summit is being held. The exhibit opened several days ago, but Punia said it hasn't attracted the crowds and revenues she expected.
Kalau pendapatan belum terlalu signifikan.
Our revenues have not significantly increased, but we have gained brand awareness. Previously, our Kamasuka Batik brand wasn't recognized by foreigners. In Indonesia alone, it is known within limited groups of people. Since the G20 summit, the governor's wife and deputy governor have started to promote our brand to Indonesians across the country.
Punia says many foreign delegates have exchanged information after buying her clothing, and she's optimistic that more customers will come after the summit ends. The COVID-19 pandemic was hard for Ninyoman Sandat, who owns a small eatery in the Nusa Dua district. During the height of the pandemic, she had no customers, but as preparations for the G20 summit began, Sandat saw an increase in sales.
Kami merasakan peningkatan yang signifikan karena adanya dari petugas keamanan yang.
We felt a significant increase in our income after police officers, security personnel, and event organizers started eating here. I'm not sure who exactly they were, but apparently my revenue rose because of them.
Organizernya saya juga nggak ngerti. Yang jelas ada peningkatan di sini ya.
Bali opened to international tourists several months ago, but the number has yet to return to pre-pandemic levels.
I hope the G20 summit would run smoothly and further improve tourism development because Nusa Dua district relies heavily on the tourism sector.
Despite safety precautions, many local residents say they are proud that Indonesia holds the presidency of the G20. They hope, in the long run, the meeting will promote peace and prosperity in a world struggling with the pandemic, food insecurity, and political tensions among the superpowers. Devyanti Farid for VOA News, Bali.
With President Biden returning to Washington, I left Indonesia and traveled to Bangkok, Thailand, where U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris led the U.S. delegation to APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum. She brought with her the message that the U.S. has an enduring economic commitment to the region. But with China such a dominant trading partner, how will that message land?
In Bangkok, I asked Tinitan Pongsudirak, Director of the Institute for Science and International Security at Chulalongkorn University.
You know, when it comes to trade and geoeconomics, the U.S. is a little bit behind the curve because it pulled out of the TPP, and the TPP became the CPTPP, excluding the U.S., but not including China. But the RCEP does include China, and now China has stepped it up by proposing this China-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement 3.0, which is an upgraded version of the RCEP, building on the earlier China-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement. So this is something I think the U.S. will be scratching its head, and a big challenge to U.S. policymakers to try to match China's latest geo-economic maneuver. But nevertheless, don't forget the U.S. is still a major investor in the region. The stock of U.S. investment is still immense. Very close to China. They take turns going back and forth. And then the high-tech industries, the U.S. still are pretty dominant, a force to reckon with. And then, the flow of trade investment, the high-tech, the innovation, the digital trade, the U.S. has a lot to offer, but so does China.
It's no secret that the view from the region is that Beijing is your bankroller and the U.S. is your security provider to maintain stability and peace. However, military officials are warning that the U.S. military must change in order to keep ahead of Russia and China. VOA's Pentagon correspondent Carla Babb has this report.
While the United States was busy fighting wars against Islamist extremists in Afghanistan and the Middle East, Russia and China steadily built up their military power. Russia now flexes those military muscles in neighboring Ukraine, while the Pentagon has dubbed China its greatest threat to national security. Speaking exclusively with VOA, General C.Q. Brown Jr., the U.S. Air Force Chief of Staff, is warning that the United States cannot be satisfied with its position as the world's superpower if it wants to stay that way.
Our adversaries have continued to advance their capabilities. At the same time, we've been using some of the same capabilities we've been using for the past 3 years. The threat we were up against is not the threat we'll see in the future, and that's why we've got to change.
China has more active duty military personnel than the United States and has spent decades advancing its weapons. In the past few years, the Chinese military has built new aircraft carriers, new fighter jets, and a massive missile arsenal. But while China spent about $250 billion on its military in fiscal year 2022, the U.S. spent nearly 8 times that amount.
It's fair to acknowledge when progress is made by those potential adversaries, but that fact alone shouldn't induce any panic in the United States. We are still relatively very, very capable, the best military force in the world.
Those talking points about military supremacies really are a relic of the past.
Army veteran and defense analyst Bradley Bowman points out that China has methodically and deliberately chosen modernizations specifically designed to defeat the United States in East Asia, the most likely battlefield should war break out over Taiwan. And that could make American ports and bases in the region vulnerable to Chinese attacks.
The Chinese have developed capabilities that are as good, in some cases better than ours. America's military edge in the Pacific has absolutely eroded, and I continue to see China sprinting, while it often seems like we in Washington are slumbering.
The Air Force reveals its newest stealth bomber, the B-21, next month. The B-21 will replace America's B-1 and B-2 bombers, which have been around since the 1980s.
This is why we want to modernize, because we have some aircraft that are, from a maintenance standpoint, are a little harder, more difficult to maintain, diminishing resources for parts, and that's the aspect of being able to modernize, so they increase the aircraft availability and ensure we have a ready force.
Even ready for what U.S. leaders hope never plays out. U.S. officials say China wants the ability to invade and hold Taiwan by 2027. And China has said it aims to be a world-class military capable of fighting and winning wars by 2049. Carla Babb, VOA News, the Pentagon.
That ends our Inside Story journey through 3 Southeast Asian countries, Cambodia, Indonesia, and Thailand, where I hope we've shown you how countries in the region aim to navigate the U.S.-China rivalry and geopolitical tensions from the war in Ukraine. For more on the Indo-Pacific, check out voanews.com. For all things White House related, follow me on Twitter at Widakuswara. I'm Patsy Widakuswara in Bangkok. See you next time on the Inside Story.